From the early days of the war in Gaza, the Israeli military has come up against significant and sometimes unique challenges on the battlefield. So today we're going to take a look at some lessons learned from the first few months of that fight, specifically in northern Gaza. This is all coming from an article titled Tactical Lessons from Israel Defense Forces Operations in Gaza 2023, published in RUSI by Jack Watling and Nick Reynolds. That full report will be linked in the description below if you want to read it. It's kind of long. What I'm going to try to do here is pull out a handful of the areas that really stood out to me and that I thought were worth discussing. I'm going to start with the operational context for anybody who's not been following this war day in and day out to hopefully still be able to get something from this video. So in terms of setting the initial conditions for this conflict, diving into the report, it's important to note that Hamas fighters deviated significantly from their own plan during its execution on October 7th. Following behind the Al-Qassam brigades, which is the militant arm of Hamas, were around 1,000 Gazans who, seeing the breaches in the fence, followed the assault force into Israeli territory and were the source of a significant proportion of social media posts and videos from 7 October. Discipline among Hamas fighters at this point appears to have broken down. The original planning document showed that Hamas had intended to fortify the positions it had seized and used hostages to complicate the IDF's retaking of these positions. I wanted to call that one out because it's not an aspect of October 7th that I've really heard before. This is saying that Hamas had their detailed plans and they started those detailed plans, but then as civilians, Gazan civilians, began to exploit this breach in the fence to come in and loot or whatever they were planning on doing, all discipline within the Hamas organization at that point kind of deteriorated and led to what eventually was the Israeli forces able to relatively quickly retake that territory that was captured by Hamas. They say in response to the 7 October attacks, the Israeli cabinet declared war on Hamas. Within the first 5 days, IDF commanders were planning operations against three core military objectives, and these are the same ones we hear today. 1, the destruction of Hamas's military infrastructure and capabilities to a point where they no longer threaten Israel. 2, the recovery of hostages. And 3, the removal of Hamas as the de facto government in Gaza in order to deny Hamas the ability to regenerate its combat power. None of those are unique. Those are objectives laid out in the early days of the war, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, and still hold true today. When you see ceasefire negotiations today, those 3 points are still hammered on by Israeli officials. They mentioned here that to accomplish these objectives, the IDF and senior officials in the Israeli government quickly determined that a ground offensive would be required to move into Gaza. This is not something they could achieve simply through airstrikes overhead. Additionally, Israel believed that there was a window of opportunity created by the October 7th attack where the international community would give Israel freedom of action. However, they recognized at some point this window would close. And I think in retrospect, looking back, that's largely what we saw. In the opening days, Israel kind of had free reign to do whatever they wanted. And you've seen over time the international community kind of tighten its grip on what they deem acceptable behavior by the Israeli forces in response to those October 7th attacks. Next up, we're going to get into the mounted and dismounted close combat lessons learned from that battlefield. But first, a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, MyHeritage. All right, so after signing up on their website and creating a profile, MyHeritage sent me this DNA kit. So we're going to crack this open and give it a shot. So in the kit, you've got 2 swabs. You do one side of the mouth and the other side of the mouth. I'll do that here in a second. That breaks off into this container that then goes into a biohazard bag and into this envelope to go back to get tested. So we'll go ahead and do one of these swabs here. The only thing I've ever heard about MyHeritage is a mix of German and or Scottish. Like Stuart might be Scottish. So we'll see. That's what my money's on right now. All right, so that clip was from about 5 weeks ago when I first got the DNA test kit. I'm wearing the same thing. I have washed it, but I thought maybe it would be helpful to not be wearing something entirely different. Either way, we got the results back, and we're going to take a look at them here in a little presentation. So we'll do this live. So remember, we're looking for German and Scottish were the two that I think. Here we go. All right, 46.5 Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. All right, we kind of saw that coming, right? Let's see what else. 43.6% English. We're at 89, 90% right now in a very small portion of the world. 6.7% Scandinavian. All right, hadn't really heard anything about that before. Anything else here? 3.2% Iberian, so Spain. That one's new. Haven't heard anything about that. And that's it. All right, no Germany. I'm going to have a word with my mom's side of the family because I've long heard that we've got some relatives in Germany. Oh, yeah, and don't sleep on the DNA matches. They actually do a really cool job of laying out all of the possible matches, possible family members around the world. I've got 28,000 to work through, so it could take me a minute, but pretty cool to see this. But either way, if you want to check this out, see what your heritage looks like, be sure to check the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen to start your free 30-day trial and use code Preston for free shipping. All right, so getting into the first series of lessons learned here, this is mounted and dismounted close combat maneuver operations. And I'm going to pull up a map of Gaza. The period of time that we're talking about right here is the end of October, really to the end of November. And it's focused mostly on combat operations in the northern portion of the Gaza Strip, in and around Gaza City. So I'm looking at live UA map here, publicly available resource, and I've gone back in time with their timeline here to November 24th, and that's the map that we have here. The blue areas are where Israeli forces moved into in the opening weeks of this war. They say the initial incursion was led by D9 bulldozers intended to overcome IEDs. A rough outline of the tactical approach saw the D9s work one bound ahead of Merkava main battle tanks, with the heavy armor moving in pairs of vehicles. They would establish overwatch to enable Namur infantry vehicles to then move forward and disembark infantry into buildings, flanking the next bound. As the mechanized infantry moved forward, light infantry would advance to clear and hold terrain to prevent attacks in the rear. Nothing all that out of the ordinary, kind of tracks. The mention of significant dozers and engineering assets up front is notable, and we're going to come back to that here later in the report as to, were they really necessary at this phase of the fight. This was really interesting that caught my attention here, talking about high-rise buildings. They say there has been some debate as to the significance of high-rise buildings during urban operations and the extent to which armies need to work out how to fight within them. The evidence from Gaza suggests that these structures are of limited military value. In terms of their use as observation posts, it is difficult for observers positioned on the higher floors to maintain oversight of the cityscape beneath them without also exposing themselves to observation. They say above a certain height, the streets become dead ground. Furthermore, fighters who move up a multi-story building lose the ability to reposition laterally. The IDF therefore found that observers would remain in the first few levels of the building, while fighters rarely ventured above the second level. It's one of those things that when you look at an urban environment, you're just drawn to those taller buildings, and you have to think about fighters up on the third, fourth, fifth, sixth level or higher that can look down across the city. But they raise a good point, and what they're saying is that in practice, especially with the use of drones and optics to be able to see at greater distances, it's not all that helpful, and it kind of restricts where the fighters are able to move. They say this is similar to what has been seen in a lot of the fighting in Ukraine. I've not seen those same reports, but it does kind of pass the common sense test if you think about it, especially in a fight like Gaza, where so much of the movement throughout the Gaza Strip is being done underground. There, a Hamas militant moving up to the sixth or seventh story of a building, it kind of takes away one of their key advantages, being able to hop into a tunnel and exit the battle space. Now, looking at some of the challenges that the IDF ran into here, they say although the IDF made rapid progress during the early break-in, rubbleization caused a range of problems. Not a term I'd come across before, but essentially what they're getting into is so much of the city was destroyed, it actually made it hard to operate in. They say the progressive reduction of the terrain to rubble through the course of fighting resulted in an irregular, congested, and complex visual environment. Forces that had been trained to talk one another onto targets using windows and floors of a building as reference points struggled to rapidly convey where one enemy was to another in structures that no longer had uniformity. Again, I think as a lot of this comes out, it just kind of hits home. You see it playing out on the ground through these different reports. And then when it's laid out like this, you say, of course. And this is another one of those that, as Israel is looking at a block, an urban block, let's say, and they might have different reference points on their maps or built into their software, rally points for the troops on the ground. And then after a few airstrikes, a few days of fighting, those buildings look very, very different. All of a sudden, the place that you had set up for a company command post is no longer there. It's very challenging in the heat of the moment to be able to talk to adjacent units about your location, their location, location of enemy fighters when the terrain around you is changing so drastically, so quickly. It's an interesting observation. They did talk a bit here about the friendly fire incidents, and a couple of them brought up, and a couple specific ones brought up here. They say on several occasions, IDF personnel being tracked as mounted units, dismounted to inspect buildings, run to colleagues' vehicles to coordinate or otherwise shifted profile. It's a dynamic battlefield. Just because somebody is mounted in a vehicle at the start of an operation does not mean they're going to be mounted throughout. They say where this caused them to appear on ISR feeds, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, so drones overhead, in both unexpected locations and as small numbers of armed dismounts, misclassification occurred in some cases. Strikes were directed against them. What they're saying here is that Israeli airstrikes were carried out against Israeli soldiers in the early days of the war when they were misidentified as Hamas militants. They say this was a particular challenge for UAV operators, since while thermal imaging allows personnel to be accurately distinguished from background terrain, it also reduces the visual distinctiveness of uniforms and equipment. The latter problem was exacerbated by IDF reservists wearing privately acquired armor and uniform elements that did not conform to IDF issue equipment. Reducing the uniformity of the force, given the lack of uniform among Hamas fighters, made it difficult to accurately distinguish targets. We do have methods to clearly identify friendly forces on the ground. We have markers and other methods to make ourselves known to friendly aircraft overhead. But at baseline, it's a lot to ask for UAV operators or aircraft that are maybe not operating on the same frequency as the troops on the ground, or maybe they cross over a boundary, prone to friendly fire in an environment like this, especially as the forces on the ground and overhead are kind of getting used to this new operating environment. I haven't heard a lot about this happening in recent months. It makes me think that Israel has resolved this issue and found better ways to coordinate between air assets, assets on the ground, and to clearly mark friendly forces even when they maneuver off their set route. They did talk a little bit about Hamas tactics, and I thought this was interesting. I'm going to go back to the map to help with this one. They said Hamas's tactics may have said to be evolved in 3 stages. And this is going to line up with anybody who's been following this war. I just hadn't really seen it broken out like this before. They said at the beginning of the operation, Hamas appears to have conceived of its defense as being based around key junctions on the anticipated Israeli axis of advance. A strong point from which the position could be overlooked would fix IDF elements on a given avenue and coordinate the movement of small teams to then attack IDF units in flanking ambushes. This approach was disrupted by the unexpected axis of the main IDF advance, which came from the north here along the coastline. After many of the designated ambush sites were approached from different directions, Hamas therefore began to raid and fight for key buildings and strongpoints. So again, kind of a set defense at the beginning, but it looks like Hamas was waiting for the main effort to come straight across the border here to the east, maybe the northeast, Beit Hanun. But instead, the primary push from Israeli forces came here along the coast and kind of went behind some of these elements. They say the fighting therefore shifted into a second stage, from being over particular intersections with favorable sight lines to building complexes that drew in IDF forces to enable attacks. You're starting to see the shift to more unconventional warfare. And then that is exactly where we land in this third stage, which they say this emerged after the week-long November ceasefire and saw the emergence of harassing attacks by small dispersed groups which would try to converge fires onto isolated IDF elements. As larger-scale engagements and the superiority of IDF fires inflicted heavy losses, Hamas instead switched to trying to attack weaker and smaller patrols of IDF personnel rather than engage combined arms units. Should not be anything surprising there for anybody following war and conflict over the last 20, 30 years. This is generally how conflicts play out, right? A force, even one that is significantly inferior in so many ways as Hamas is to the IDF, they try to take them on in a relatively conventional manner right out the gate. And over time, sometimes days, other times weeks, other times months or years, you kind of descend into more of an insurgency, guerrilla type warfare, which is largely what we're seeing in the day-to-day operations in Gaza right now. A note here, however, in the report that I thought was interesting is they said the near uniform adaptation among Hamas cells demonstrates that they retained the ability to pass information during the initial phase of IDF operations, suggesting that the IDF was unsuccessful in fully degrading Hamas's command and control. It makes sense, right? It's hard to figure that out exactly, right? Because you're not going to get that answer from Hamas. And they call out right at the beginning of this report, they were not able to talk to Hamas to get their side of the story throughout these tactical situations. But that is one indication that they still had a pretty significant command and control network. If the tactics across the Gaza Strip are simultaneously changing in the same direction, that shows that they still have a degree of control. A hot topic here that I wanted to bring up as soon as I saw it was the active protection systems, APS, being used by Israeli forces in Gaza. They said the sporadic anti-tank guided missile and persistent RPG threat, often manifesting from 30 to 50 meter distance from IDF vehicles, posed a challenge for active protection systems, APS, where APS had either been turned off, did not have a sufficient line of sight between the sensor and the threat, or had already been expended. Hits were achieved on IDF vehicles. And this is a constant argument. Anytime you see a Hamas video, 9 times out of 10, you see a detonation along the side of the vehicle, and it's hard to tell if it was the APS initiating and shooting down the munition, because that is an explosion, or if it's an actual detonation against the side of the vehicle. This was a hot topic for Israel trying to resolve in the early days of the war. They say, nevertheless, while Hamas believed that APS could be defeated with close engagements, as in getting inside the sensor range, this problem was resolved through software updates. In most cases, APS proved effective. Nevertheless, it was found that having pairs of vehicles operate in intimate support helped to increase their survivability, as the APS could often overlap and thereby increase the magazine depth to protect the vehicles. So in all of these situations, you're seeing adaptations by both sides. To try to defeat the APS, Hamas is moving in closer to the Israeli vehicles inside of 30 to 50 meters, which is right at the kind of minimum arming distance for some of these warheads. And then for some of these RPG warheads they're utilizing. And then Israel, in return, just added a software patch, making the APS activate at closer ranges, and started overlapping vehicles to make sure that that protective ring was a little bit bigger and maybe cover some blind spots. Turning now to combat engineering, sappers, demining, all of that. They said Israeli operations started with the assumption that Hamas would have extensively laid landmines and IEDs along the anticipated routes into Gaza. Pulling back up a map here. So, and this was my thought as well in the opening days of the war. Thus, Israeli forces at first either avoided roads or only used them in conjunction with meticulous clearance operations and support from D9 bulldozers, which slowed the pace of their advance. The IDF determined that it required 20 D9s per brigade to meet the required tempo of operations. It's a lot of dozers, and they mentioned that only the lead elements ended up with that quantity of, to a degree, demining equipment. However, they say this proved largely unnecessary, as Hamas had not laid mines in sufficient concentration, and those that it had deployed along roads were often surface laid and thus easy to detect and simple to remove. It's debatable, and this is something I think is worth discussing, whether Hamas's decision to not lay significant IEDs on the roads into Gaza reflected a recognition that Israel's combat engineering assets would make those efforts redundant. Why did Hamas not lay IEDs in the volume that we thought they were going to? And then the ones that they did were just sitting out on top of the road. We know Hamas has that capability. They get into it here in the next section, talking about how many of these IEDs are still being uncovered and the challenges it's posing to dismounted units, maneuver units in the IDF, as they're finding homes rigged with explosives, IEDs on every other road, tunnel entrances, tunnels themselves rigged with explosives. So that capability exists, and it has for a long time. It was no secret. Why did Hamas not utilize it early in the conflict? There's a bit of an argument that it might have been due to upsetting the civilian population, and they didn't want. It's one of the challenges with IEDs is anytime you set one of these out, it's not entirely certain who the victim is going to be. So maybe there was some pushback from the civilian population, but either way, it is notable, especially now looking back, that Hamas did not lean heavily on the use of IEDs to protect their territory in the early days of the war. Then turning to the tunnels, it's relatively unique to the war that Israel is fighting in Gaza, but still worth diving into here. They say in the years prior to the October 7th attack, Hamas claims to have constructed more than 500 kilometers of tunnel networks under Gaza. The tunnels and their entrances run under residential buildings, schools, mosques, and hospitals. We've seen countless footage and pictures of those at this point. They say to describe Hamas's subterranean infrastructure merely as tunnels is a mischaracterization. Some were intended as covert passageways between points, such as beneath Wadi Gaza. Others were made with the intent to bypass Israeli defenses. Still, others housed barracks, C2 centers, command and control centers, data storage, and manufacturing facilities. They say there are roughly 2 levels of subterranean infrastructure: commanders' tunnels and operatives' tunnels. These are separated, with commanders' tunnels running deeper and with a better quality of construction and more facilities, enabling them to be used for longer-term habitation and operations. They said the tunnels are not one single network, which I think was a misunderstanding early in the war. While some sections are linked, many are smaller subnetworks that are not integrated into an overall underground structure, with the segmentation of the network limiting the exploitation potential of any given tunnel. So a couple big takeaways there. Very different tunnel networks, not connected at all. So when you get down into the tunnel network, it's not that all of a sudden you're there. You might clear something as long as 5 kilometers of tunnels, but it's disconnected from other tunnels even right next door to it. That's a major challenge, right? So you not only have to clear the entire thing, you have to make sure it doesn't connect to any other tunnels and then go find those and clear those as well. You've got the commander's tunnels, C2 tunnels, and then the fighter's tunnels. The fighter's tunnel is much more rudimentary, designed to just move forces between one location and another. And then another key piece here being that these commander tunnels are designed for longer-term habitation. We've seen a couple of those in the northern portion of the Strip, not as many as we move further south. I think it's probably because those are still being exploited. They say at the beginning of the operation, the IDF conceived of surface and subsurface operations as occurring sequentially. Ground would then be occupied and thereafter searched, with tunnels found and denied. As this operation developed, it became evident that this allowed Hamas to persist in conducting ambushes for a protracted period and to then transition to a layered defense of underground facilities. Nor could underground infrastructure be safely bypassed. Instead, therefore, the surface and subsurface fighting needed to be carried out simultaneously, posing competing dilemmas for Hamas's scheme of maneuver. So what they're saying there is at one point the idea was you clear the above ground area, then you kind of sweep through and find any of the tunnels, you go down and clear the tunnels, and then you can say this entire area is clear. But what they found in doing that is as they moved through the surface, Hamas just continued to move underground and kind of would pop back up in areas on the surface that had been previously cleared. So the only way to do this effectively is to do it simultaneously. That is so hard to even try to explain, let alone carry out, to clear above ground and below ground at the same time. They say to enable the widespread deliberate clearance of Hamas's tunnel network, the IDF increasingly paired conventional and special operations units together, conventional above ground, special operations forces below ground. By coordinating offensive operations above and below ground, dilemmas could be imposed on Hamas, constraining their movements and preventing them from using the tunnels as they wished. While robots and military working dogs assisted in route proving in tunnels, much of the clearance operation continued to have to be carried out by humans, given the number of doors, steps, and other obstacles confronted. This last piece I want to spend a moment on because I hear a lot about this when looking at tunnel clearances or even buildings being cleared in Gaza. Dogs are great. They do a wonderful job in detecting booby traps, mines, IEDs in the battlefield, robots as well, and they've come a long ways in recent years. But there's just little things that they can't do, right? A door in a hallway, in a tunnel, cannot be overcome by most robots and by any dog. So that's it. You put something on a shelf in a home, an IED up on a shelf or a camera maybe, the dog can't see it, the dog can't get to it, the robot can't reach it. So there's a lot of limitations with these tools that we have at our disposal in the military, and what they're saying is that in a lot of cases, any clearance operations, especially underground, relied on soldiers themselves conducting that clearance. They said one challenge to simultaneous surface and subterranean maneuver was that the tunnels did not adhere to the boundaries of the units operating above ground. Because the need to have relays behind an advancing force in the tunnel to maintain communications, the C2 of units underground had to be managed by the brigade to which the forces were attached. Nevertheless, they would often cross into another unit's boundary. So again, it's one of these things where the enemy doesn't plan how you want them to plan, if you will. In conventional war, you see this all the time where they try to line up and kind of attack at unit boundaries, the potential weak point where communication could be less. And what they found in Gaza, which should be no shock, is the unit boundaries that the IDF laid out based off of overhead imagery and streets and things like that did not match with the tunnels underground. And they would regularly have, 2 units overhead with one tunnel network underground, and kind of having to sync those resources is tough. So all of this with this tunnel piece here, when you're wondering why it's taking so long to effectively clear all these tunnels and new ones are still popping up, hopefully that gives a little context. It is such an incredibly challenging task to navigate what is under Gaza right now. The last piece here that I thought was worth getting into was talking about the information operations, and it's going to call out a few points that, again, if you're following this war, are going to be hit very close to home. You're going to recognize these. They say, despite being forward-leaning on much information release, information operations is an area where the IDF has underperformed during the conflict. First, there have been inconsistencies between Israel's military and political messaging that have undermined the communication of many of the control measures put in place by the IDF. Second, the IDF has repeatedly inflated expectations of what will be found. For example, by briefing there is a Hamas C2 center beneath the Al-Shifa hospital and releasing graphics suggesting a digitized C2 hub, and then failing to reveal something that met expectations. The IDF also undermined its own credibility by presenting a document showing the days of the week as a guard roster for hostages owing to a shortage of Arabic speakers. Both of those things did a significant job on Israeli credibility. And if you're following this war, head to any comment section talking about the conflict, and you're going to see one or both of those things brought up to this day. So the first one, I actually think they did a really good job in the article calling it out specifically, because there were tunnels uncovered in and around the Shifa hospital complex. There were weapons uncovered there. There was communications infrastructure uncovered there. That existed. They found it. But what it did not meet was the expectation set by the IDF of some massive digitized C2 center. So I think they phrased that well there. And then, of course, the nonsense around the guard roster that just was a sloppy error. There's no other way to put that. They say between these tactical errors, it is notable that Israel has not been proactive in controlling the narrative surrounding the conflict. A good example of this is the reporting of casualty figures. Civilian casualties are to be expected in high numbers during any urban operation. However, they say the Gaza Health Ministry has a track record of producing reasonably accurate aggregate counts of casualties in previous rounds of fighting. But during the current war, the level of damage to health infrastructure has caused the ministry to have to change its methodologies from a central reporting system to a scrape of social media and reports from families, rendering aggregate numbers more questionable. We've talked about that before on this channel. It's not that the Gaza Health Ministry is always wrong. In fact, historically, they've been very, very accurate. It's that how the war is playing out right now in Gaza is very, very different. And they don't have access to the same tools or the same infrastructure they have in past conflicts. So it's very hard to look at what they're doing and say it's going to be the same quality as when they had access to all of that infrastructure. They say the issue from an information operations point of view, however, is not the precision of the overall count. Because the health ministry is controlled by Hamas, it can issue disinformation at critical moments. For example, the ministry was quoted by journalists as stating that 500 civilians had been killed at a hospital by an airstrike, with much subsequent confusion, when in reality a Palestinian rocket had harmed a smaller number of civilians at the site. If you remember the first few months of the war, it was a major story, and a lot of it emanating from the Gaza Health Ministry. They say Israel has been quick to use the many inconsistencies in health ministry data to try to undermine its credibility. The efforts have failed, however, and this is important, because there is no alternative data source. Again, something when they say it out loud, you say, yeah, of course that's going to be a thing, but you see it brought up in a handful of conversations around this conflict is people say, how could you trust the Gaza Ministry of Health? And you say, well, there's not another source talking about total number of casualties in Gaza. Israel's not really releasing that. Occasionally they'll talk about estimates of killed Hamas fighters, but there's certainly been civilian casualties. We know that. There's nobody else tracking that right now. So what they're talking about here in terms of kind of losing the information wars, Israel is not taking advantage of presenting a viable alternative when those numbers are presented. So anyways, some pretty interesting assessments there. I think some new, some old, some just kind of presented in a different manner, but worth thinking about, for Israel, for any military around the world, kind of watching as this war plays out. Again, I'll link this full report in the description below if you want to check that out, along with a link to the sponsor of today's video, MyHeritage. Again, you can scan this QR code or use the link in the description below to start your free 30-day trial of MyHeritage, and be sure to use code Preston for free shipping. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.